In this presentation, we're going to go through indirect functional behavior assessment. Hopefully you've watched at least the first 20 or 25 minutes or so of the interview with Dr. Brian Iwata. Um, if you haven't, watch that first before you watch this. At the beginning of that interview, they go through the different forms of functional behavior assessment, and you begin to get Dr. Iwata's perspective. Now, just for those of you who don't know, Dr. Brian Iwata wrote the very first scholarly paper on functional analysis of behavior that was published way back in 1982. So he is regarded as um, the primary scholar for introducing functional behavior assessment to practitioners. Now, he certainly has his. If you listen when you as you listen to the rest of the interview, which we're going to be doing in in preparation for next week's class, as you listen to it, he is very strongly biased towards functional analysis as opposed to functional assessment because that's been the focus of his research. He's conducted very controlled studies, and there's a lot of he's done some very good work and he's had a huge influence on the field, but there there are other perspectives that we'll be considering. He does discuss indirect functional behavior assessment at the beginning of that interview, and he does give some importance to it. I have a position that indirect assessment is more important for practitioners than he sort of lets on. The problem though is it has become the only functional assessment that is used in many cases, and in some cases even a very poorly cursorily done indirect functional behavior assessment has become all that gets done, and you're going to see that that is completely inadequate. The indirect part of a functional behavior assessment is the beginning. It's what the field is beginning to call case conceptualization, bringing together available information to clearly define the issue or problem so that we can begin to formulate an effective intervention. So we'll talk about indirect functional behavior assessment in regards to its role in case conceptualization. I jumped ahead here. Identifying the consequences of a behavior. Now, of course, when we talk about consequences, we mean events that follow the behavior that might serve as reinforcers, either positive or negative reinforcers that will motivate the person to continue to engage in this behavior. And that leads to the next one. What's the function of the behavior? The function is the purpose the behavior serves. So the function is to access reinforcement in some form. And we've talked about different forms of reinforcement. There's positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And what purpose does this behavior serve? So the hypothesis has several elements. As you remember from 554, hypothesis includes the antecedents or the motivating operations. It includes all the behaviors that are members of the response class related to that function. By response class, remember we're talking about all the behaviors that serve the same function. So we don't write a hypothesis statement about every behavior. So a kid may have 6 challenging behaviors. They could all serve the same function. We're going to put those all in one hypothesis. So and let's say that all 6 of these behaviors serve the function of escaping from difficult tasks. So the hypothesis statement includes motivating operations if they're identified, antecedents, all the behaviors in the response class, and the function. Once we have a hypothesis or a working hypothesis, then we decide what observational data can we collect to answer some questions. Usually after an indirect assessment, we have a lot of questions, but it helps us formulate which questions we need to ask. Then we have to decide what is the method of collecting some data that is going to answer those questions. So we just don't want to just randomly collect data or just, we happen to have a lot of these data sheets, so we're going to do this kind of data. Now, what's the data that's going to give you what you need? That's always the question you should ask when you collect any kind of data is, how is this data going to inform your practice? What's it going to tell you? Is it tell you what you need? So as a quick overview with functional assessment, of course, is an overarching category. And there are three broad methods or subcomponents of functional assessment. The one we're talking about right now is indirect assessment methods. Then we have direct methods, and then finally environmental manipulation or functional analysis. And this is Brian Iwata's shining star. He's the champion of functional analysis. So with an indirect functional behavior assessment, it's indirect because these are methods that are based on informant information. So they're not based on direct observation of a behavior. So that includes doing an interview, and even if it's an informal interview, or one of the semi-structured functional assessment interviews that we have. And we're going to use a couple in this class. It's going back and looking at existing records, incident reports, old data sheets that was of whatever we can find. So, incident reports, office referrals, instructional data, um, notes and logs, transcripts from meetings, whatever we can find that's going to give us information can be used as part of an indirect functional behavior assessment. And then there are scales. There's several. The one that we're going to talk about a little more detail is the motivation assessment scale. There's several others. Uh, mm, they're probably I can't recommend one as being a lot better. There are some of these scales that are better for certain individuals. If you're going to work with folks with moderate or severe disabilities, probably the motivation assessment scale is more geared to that. The questions don't make as much sense if you're talking about someone, say, with high functioning autism or mild cognitive disabilities. The Some of the others may be more appropriate, but they all give you sort of the same information. They're sort of similar. Now, always remember with these scales, even though it is an instrument, they are subjective in that they are still basing their information on an informant. So always remember with indirect methods, it's always informant based. Even when you're reviewing records, it's someone's impressions they wrote down. So it's not hard and fast evidence. So I use indirect methods a lot. I think they're very valuable. I never lose sight of the fact that this is someone's perceptions, and perceptions can be influenced by a lot of things. The next set of strategies that we're going to focus more on next week are direct methods. So, direct methods record data of ongoing uh, environmental events. So you watch what's already happening and you collect data on it. There are different methods we're going to talk about. A scatter plot is a really simple method of just keeping track of time and place when a behavior occurs. The ABC recording, many of you have some kind of experience with, but it actually can be pretty valuable. It's been around a long time if it is done by people who have been trained and know useful information to record. It can be extremely valuable. If it is done in such a way that people are not informed and it's useless. I've seen people collect pages and pages of ABC data that is just the most useful thing you could do to it is recycle it. For example, if you always put as consequence, your programmed response, people get the idea of, I took 5 points away. That was the consequence. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about what environmental changes resulted after the occurrence of the behavior that might function as reinforcers. Well, if you think that the kid is really getting off on you taking points away, that's possible. And I have seen kids that would do that. They like to see adults react in negative ways. So, but you have to understand principles of behavior, and it takes actually quite a bit of training to do an ABC recording so that it's useful. And I see it used all the time by people who've had very little instruction in it, and you get useless information. It's not as good as a good interview if you have ABC data that doesn't give you anything. Functional analysis observation is a little more structured. It's usually involves a form. There's several of them that sort of give you the same information as an ABC recording, but it's a little more structured. It has coded information that you can code. Um, we'll talk about this later, but sometimes these give folks the idea, well, they can be a double-edged sword with the structure because people have more confidence in them sometimes as being objective, but they have some of the same limitations as ABC recording. If people don't understand what they're actually supposed to be recording, it can also be useless information. So we're going to spend time on how to do these properly so that you get useful information. The final strategy, environmental manipulations or functional analysis, and you'll hear Dr. Iwata talk about this a lot. It involves actually changing the environment and doing, in effect, an experiment to test out your hypotheses. Now, there's lots of data that shows that this is the most definitive method of doing a functional analysis, but it also has some limitations. It is not looked on very favorably by school administrators for sure, because what you're actually doing as part of this is you're setting up some environmental conditions that you believe are going to escalate the behavior. And that's why you're doing it. You want to test out, if I do this, will this kid engage in this behavior more? And that is a problem in a lot of situations. You have to ensure the person's safety. You have to ensure the safety of everyone else in the environment. We will talk about some there's some strategies coming along that actually have some of the advantages of functional analysis, but they're more like direct observation. So um, we'll talk about more trial-based functional analysis, which is an up-and-coming strategy. And your textbook actually discusses this quite a bit, so we'll be exploring that as well. So, what are the steps for doing an indirect functional assessment? Um, if I'm doing a functional assessment, the first thing I want to do is I want to do an interview with some people who have observed the behavior, and ideally with several people who have observed the student engaging in the behavior in different situations. If I have the ability to talk to a parent and about the home situation, that's awesome. If the student has the communication skills to answer questions, then a student assisted interview sometimes gives uh, fantastic information. Now, one point about the student assisted interview, many times I have gone in to do a student assisted interview, and my expectation is that this student is going to give me no useful information, and I have been completely surprised by some of the information, even from individuals with limited verbal skills. Sometimes they've been able to articulate or tell me things that gave me an enormous amount of insight into their behavior. Other times I go into this thinking this is going to be a really useful interview, and it's a kid that, is extremely verbal, but they're just sort of, I get the sense they're just telling me what they think I want to hear, or they want to make themselves look as good as possible. So, you know, it, I learned something, but it's a different kind of information. So you have to, if you think it may get be useful, do a student assisted interview, and then if you can use the information, great. But realize that sometimes it's not going to give you real clear information. You will always learn something about the student, though. Reviewing existing records can be extremely helpful. Especially if kids have moved around, sometimes people have not gone through records with a lot of detail. Look for existing interventions. Now, part of what we want to do is establish a history of things that have been tried. One of the disadvantages of this is you're rarely going to see information about the fidelity with which an intervention was implemented. So you may see that they tried a differential reinforcement of low rates of behavior intervention and it didn't work. Well, do you have details about how they established the criteria for reinforcement, and do you have details about the how consistent people were with implementing the intervention? It may not have worked simply because it wasn't done correctly, or it may not have worked because it wasn't the right intervention. But it is always a good idea to have as much information as possible about things that have been done in the past and how long has this been a problem. Behaviors that have long histories are going to be harder to change. They have longer reinforcement histories. Um, Behaviors that occur across all settings are going to be more difficult. So that's always useful information to have. The motivation assessment scale can be particularly useful if you're not getting good interview information. Sometimes when I'm doing a functional assessment interview, people can't get away from giving me really global impressions. It's hard for them to isolate what's going on. I'll give you an example. It was a couple of years ago. I was talking with a teacher who she'd been around for a while. She didn't like the functional assessment process. She thought behavior programs were ridiculous, and so her questions were when I would ask, well, when is this behavior? Oh, he does it all the time. Is there, does it happen more with one person or another? No, it happens with everybody. How long has this been a problem? As long as I've known it. She was just really snippy, and her answers were, it's a problem all the time. It happens with anybody. Um, he doesn't get anything out of it. So I did the motivation assessment scale, and she simply had to rate things. So it wasn't really answering questions. The process of doing that scale and thinking about the answer and how you're going to rate it on a scale of 1 to 6 sort of got her thinking about the behavior differently. So I stopped the interview pretty early on. I did the motivation assessment scale and I scored it, right there in front of her. And then I went back and I asked some more questions, sort of like following up from the motivation assessment scale. The quality of the answers I got, or at least the information I got from her responses, was improved a great deal. So I think it can be useful in that way. In all honesty, when I do the motivation assessment scale, it always I have like two or three functions that are really high together sometimes. It doesn't do a great job of discriminating functions, but it does sometimes point things out, and simply the structure of it helps with the interview process sometimes. Direct functional behavior assessment means we're collecting direct observational data, and the simplest form of that is just a scatter plot. A scatter plot, as you remember from 554, is just a grid that has dates on one axis and times of the day on the other axis. And if the behavior occurs within a period of time, say 30 minutes or an hour, if you base it on the schedule, you just fill that block in. Or you can be a little more fancy and have a code, like if it happens one time, you make one slash mark. If it happens twice, you make another slash mark to make an X, and then if it happens more than twice, you just fill the block in. So I do that sometimes. But the nice thing about a scatter plot is you can look across days and see if there are patterns in time. And that's actually what I did with the case I just mentioned. And we did identify some patterns, and I was able to go back and observe in those situations and learn more. So scatter plot can be really valuable even though it's very simple. So here's a question for you. Is a student interview an indirect functional behavior assessment method? Where you're talking directly to the student, right? Yes, it is. Well, you can look at the slide and see it's under indirect, but that's something people get wrong often. They figure if you're talking to the student, that has to be direct, right? It's still the student's perceptions. So direct means we're recording behavior, even though it's something simple like a scatter plot, it's still direct. To do any of these, you need a clear definition of the behavior. None of it's going to make any sense if you don't have that. So um, I usually sometimes spend a lot of time coming up with good, clear definitions of the behavior. With a functional assessment interview, the questions are designed to answer, um, to give you information for different components of a hypothesis statement. So regardless of the form of interview that you use, you're going to have a set of questions that deal with antecedents. And I'm going to use the word triggers here. It's not my favorite, but it's one that people understand. So when I'm doing an interview, I will talk about triggers of behavior because it's for some people it's easier for them to relate to if I describe antecedents, and I'm certainly not going to talk about motivating operations when I'm talking with general education folks. So I'll talk about triggers for behavior. So I'll say, I'm going to ask you some questions. Some of these questions are going to be discussing the triggers of behaviors or things that might, you know, predict a behavior, or things that might be associated with it. And then some of the questions are going to be related to things that happen after a behavior. We call these consequences, but I don't mean these are things you do to try to change a behavior. We're looking for things that might be motivating this student to continue this behavior. So I am open about, there's nothing secretive about this. You don't, it doesn't involve deceit or giving a person the impression to try to trick them into giving a certain kind of answer. Just be real upfront and try to explain the purpose of it to the person that you're interviewing. So there are questions about when, and some interviews get into detail about, is it based on periods of the month? Is it based on, a cycle within a year, like seasonal things? That could indicate that there could be an allergy issue, or with monthly cycles, it could be a hormonal issue. Is there something associated with the time of day as opposed to the type of demand for that time of day? Or are there certain points in the student's schedule? There are typically questions that ask specific things about types of activities and expectations and requirements. For example, the questions may be related to, is this behavior more or less likely to occur when you ask the student to write something, or when the student's asked to do something really specific? Or are there any specific tasks or activities that you could do that would be really likely that you'd see this problem? And if the answer is no, then that points or suggests that escape may not be the function. Then there are questions about with whom the behavior occurs. Is it more or less likely with certain people? And then there are questions about, well, we already talked about location, but so these questions all will point to possible antecedents and possible functions. Um, some interviews actually will come out and say, when this happens, does it look like this student's trying to get your attention or trying to escape something? Written record reviews, like student interviews, sometimes they can be extremely useful and sometimes they're not very useful. I always want to look at a social emotional history. So I'll try to find a social work report if I can find it. And I always look for the speech report and psychological evaluations. Those documents give me a lot of information. I want to look at previous individualized plans. I want to look for previous behavior programs, incident reports, anything that's going to give me data. So I usually start with the evaluations to give me some background, and then I look for previous interventions, and I'm looking for a history of this problem. When did it first appear in the record as a problem, and what was the situation? Sometimes that can give me some information about a possible initial function. Now, behaviors change over time. Sometimes functions of behavior change. What may start out as a behavior that is the kid's trying to get attention, the kid may also learn that it results in escape sometimes, so you can get an additional function. Um, Sometimes records can indicate what the primary function might have been initially, and sometimes that can be useful. It also may give me some information as to how the response class might have evolved. Sometimes challenging behavior will start out with one behavior serving a specific function, and then later on other behaviors emerge. So you get a group of behaviors that all are serving the same function. Now, when this happens, sometimes it's important to know what was that initial behavior. That might have some impact on where I start with my intervention. And so, as we said, as record review, it can give you a good snapshot of history. It can give you some ideas about when the behavior started, what interventions have been tried. It usually does not give you good information about antecedents or functions. Sometimes, if you have an old functional behavior assessment that was actually done with some integrity, that can be useful. But many times, I find documents that are called functional behavior assessments that are just sort of useless. They just kind of give me a list of antecedents and a list of consequences, and then magically at the bottom they say the function of this behavior is, but I can't see any information that was based on. So I think often these are done, just people get around a table and they say, okay, what's the function of the behavior? Just as with interviews, we always know that this is subjective information almost always. It's with someone's impression they wrote down as part of the record. So always consider that when you're interpreting it and using it. We already talked about, I sort of got ahead of myself. These are typical questions on an interview, so you can look through these, but they all address components of a hypothesis statement. What are the antecedents? In other words, what are the situations, conditions under which the behavior occur? Is it more likely with certain people? Is it more likely in certain situations? Is it more likely when certain demands are placed on the person? And then what are the behaviors that are part of that response class? And then what are the outcomes the person's after? What's the things that you're assessing? What's the typical response, patterns and activities? Again, we talked about all this. I like to do these with a couple of different people. Sometimes I'll use the same form if it's not too cluttered, and I'll just use a different color ink to distinguish between responses that different people made. The student assisted interview is in your packet. The version that I use is by Dunlap, Clark and Childs. It's been around a long time, as you can see, but it it meets a need. It has four primary sections. Um, One of them deals with possible behavior function. The other deals with context or settings, looking at antecedents. The other section deals with subjects the kid likes, and another deals with context. So it can be useful information depending on the student or client. So what do you want to have after you do an interview? First and foremost, you want a very clear definition of the challenging behavior. Sometimes this is the most important outcome you're going to get from an interview. If you have a clear definition of the behaviors, that lays the foundation for getting good, meaningful observational data. If you don't have a good definition, you can't get data that's going to be useful and meaningful. So don't shortchange this part. Spend the time you need to spend to get a good definition of the behavior. It's worth the time. And again, it may be the most important thing you get from that interview. The next important thing is some initial hypotheses. So a hypothesis statement includes a statement of the antecedents or setting events or motivating operations if you can uncover them, and the behaviors that are all in the response class, and the function or maintaining consequence. So an example of a hypothesis statement might be when Woody has stayed up late watching Downton Abbey reruns, recordings, and he's given a difficult task in the morning. He is likely to rip up the paper, curse, yell, and flip over a desk in order to escape or avoid the demand. So that's a hypothesis statement. And you may have several of these. Remember, you want a hypothesis statement for each function, not for each behavior. So you may have several behaviors that all serve the same function. If you've identified two possible functions, you need two hypothesis statements. This seems to be a really difficult thing for people to grasp for some reason. And it's real common that people will do these and they have six behaviors, they have six hypothesis statements. Then I look at them and all the hypothesis statements have to do with escaping demands. And I tell them, you have one hypothesis statement. Put all this information into one. The reason you do that is you're going to start building your interventions from your hypothesis statements. The fewer hypothesis statements you have, the simpler it is to start your intervention. Or more specifically, your intervention is going to be built around functions of behavior, not topography of behavior. So it's not what the behavior looks like or the form, it's the function that it has. What are the pros and cons of doing an interview? We've already talked about most of these, but they can be useful. Again, it gives you a lot of information, relatively short period of time, and you have the advantage of using the experience of people that have been able to observe the behavior over a longer period of time. This is for low frequency, high intensity behaviors, things that don't happen very often, but when they happen, they're serious problems. This can be an extremely important piece in the process. There's kids that I have gone to try to observe, and I just don't see the behavior. It doesn't happen that frequently. But if I can do an interview with two or three people who have observed the behavior, I can gather a lot of information. So it helps me, first of all, clearly define what we're looking at, and that helps us assess the need of an intervention. And then you can get broad information about the ecology of the behavior, the environmental situations around it. Sometimes things emerge in an interview that were not apparent to the people giving the interview. They weren't things that you thought of right away. This happened really early in my career. I was working with group homes for adults with developmental disabilities, and there was one young man who would, in the evening, he would have these tantrums and he would go through and he would trash the house. He would throw furniture, he would shove and push people down, he would break things. And the incident reports always just said we were sitting at home, we were watching television, and then for no reason he started just flipping furniture over and pushing people. It was always for no reason, and they would have to sort of escort him away from the other clients in the group homes to keep someone from getting hurt. So I did a functional assessment interview with three of the people that had observed this, and what became apparent is that all of these incidents had something in common. They had all gone on a trip that evening, so they had gone somewhere, and then they came back home, and it was late, and immediately they started telling folks to get ready to go to bed. Well, usually this wasn't a problem for him, but he liked going out and doing things if they go to a movie or if they go out to dinner and then go to the festival of some kind. Then they come home, he was all charged up, and then they start saying, okay, go get ready for bed. And he didn't want to go to bed. So he would just start, flipping things around. And so he extended his time before he had to go to bed, but at the same time, he got kind of carried to a different area. Um, so that was a pattern that people didn't see until we started asking questions, and then we backed that up with some observational data, and it was true. And that made the intervention really easy. Essentially, what we did is on evenings when they went out, they would give him a choice. Here's some things you can do. You can help us straighten up the house. You can do this. You can help us get ready for breakfast in the morning. We'll lay some things out, or you can go to your room and and he liked looking at magazines, look at magazines, or you can get ready to go to bed. So it gave him a little time, and he didn't get that direct demand to go to bed. He wasn't verbal, so he couldn't tell people. He just acted through his behavior. The disadvantages. Well, the biggest disadvantage is interviews are always subjective. It's always based on someone's impressions or perceptions, and there are many things that will influence someone's perception. For one thing, history influences perception. This is a real common phenomena. You can have a client, a kid, an individual who has a history of challenging behavior, and that person can have phenomenal progress and do extremely well. Like months, can have months with no problem. If that person has a really horrendous day, and you go that day and talk to people, say at the end of the day, and say, okay, tell me about Woody's behavior. Oh, it's awful. Has there been any? No, there's been no improvement. He's doing this is just as much as it always has been. It's getting worse. And that's not the reality, but that's their perception right then because they just had a really tough day and they're remembering all the previous tough days they had, and you sort of forget sometimes the weeks and weeks where there have been very few problems. Um, that's I see that all the time. That's why it's so important to collect data and to review it and graph it. Data gives you the reality if it's good data. Um, they can take time. They're not really short. So, you're talking about 45 minutes to do a good interview. That's why it's good to do them in several chunks, or again, if you can do some of them Skyping. Um, if you have to interview multiple people, that's multiplying that time. So, two people, you're talking about an hour and a half spent interviewing. If you're getting good information, it's time extremely well spent. They are sometimes difficult to summarize. Um, but my summary is a hypothesis statement, and sometimes it might be a couple. And then, it's a matter of subjectively how much faith do you have in that hypothesis statement. So sometimes I'll write a note sort of saying, well, this is the best hypothesis statement I can come up with, but I don't have a lot of confidence in it based on the interview. So it's a possibility. But what it always does, regardless, even if I'm not confident in that hypothesis, it points me in the direction of data that is going to help me answer questions. So it informs my next step. That's the most valuable role that an interview has, or any of the indirect methods. They help you conceptualize the problem. So we'll call it case conceptualization. And they give us a clear definition of what the problems actually are. And they lay the foundation. They help us generate the questions for which we need answers. So it's a first step. Unfortunately, in many cases, they become, shh, my dog's growling at a puppy running by. It becomes the only functional behavior assessment. That's totally unacceptable. Um, these slides just give you some summaries of different scales and instruments. I'm not going to go through them because it's simply just you can read the points. But take a look at the motivation assessment scale. If you have an opportunity, give it a shot. Try it out on, just fill it out on an individual that you know and see what you get. So all the questions are related to a function, and the functions are social, tangible, escape, sensory. And you generate a raw score for each one of those, and then you sort of take the average rating for each category, and then you rank order from highest to lowest mean rating. So the highest would be a function that is, the most likely, lowest is least likely. Um, And you compare this to what you got from your interview. And sometimes they might line up, spot on, and sometimes they might be completely different. So you may revise your initial hypotheses based on the motivation assessment scale, or you may choose not to. It gives you a little more information. I would never do a motivation assessment scale and nothing else. It wouldn't inform me that much. To be honest with you, it also is going to reflect the perceptions. If a person really believes that everything a kid on the autism spectrum does is related to sensory needs, if it's that person's perception, and you do this scale is going to say is sensory is going to be number one. And that may in fact not be true for that particular kid. So, uh, as long as you realize it is very subjective, it can be another source of information. As you can tell, I'm not really a huge fan of rating scales. I think you can get um, better information from a good interview, and there's no pretense that an interview is not subjective. These are the steps that you go through. I think it's pretty obvious. You just do the ratings, and then you average them, and then you rank them. you do need to do the motivation assessment scale. And here's a little bit of a paradox. The authors say that you should do this for each class of behavior. So if you have three behaviors that serve the same function, then you do the interview saying, okay, for these three behaviors, answer these questions. And then the next class, like, okay, for these behaviors, answer the same question. All right, well, here's my problem with it, with that logic. You're doing a functional behavior assessment to determine the function. If you already knew the function, you wouldn't be doing this. And you can't determine what behaviors are in a response class unless you know the function. So you're not really going to know response classes very often. The best you can do, if you can identify behaviors that frequently happen together, so the kid may do like escalate through a sequence of behaviors. Those are, you've got a pretty good possibility that those are a response class, because it's very often the case that kids will escalate from one behavior to another. They're trying to get a certain outcome, and when one behavior doesn't work, they switch to a different one. So behaviors that happen like that, you're pretty safe to think of those as a response class, all serving the same function, and you can do the interview for all of those behaviors in that chunk. If not, sometimes you just have to do it for different behaviors and look at how similar they are. The problem behavior questionnaire is similar to the MAS. It is a little better for kids with milder disabilities, so I will use it in those situations. The questions are just more tailored to kids with milder disabilities, but it also has questions that are related to specific functions. It labels them a little differently. So you get five categories. You get peer escape, peer attention, adult escape, adult attention, and setting events as categories. It tends to not really address sensory issues at all. And here's just a little information on the scoring and interpretation of the problem behavior questionnaire. It's actually pretty straightforward. You record the scores, then you draw a line connecting them, and it gives you a profile across the categories. Um, for interpreting scores, they consider any score that is greater than 4 to be quote unquote significant. And then any category that has two scores or more with a score of 4 or higher is considered to be a category that's a likely function. So um, just general guide. The scoring and interpretation is pretty straightforward on these. Like all of them, remember that they are subjective. So what are the pros for these? Well, they're quick. The rating scales don't take very long to do. They're easy to summarize. They're easy to interpret. Um, they do suggest information about antecedents and consequences, so they can support or not support hypothesis statements that you generated from an interview. I would never generate a hypothesis statement from a rating scale, but you can use it with a rating scale to give you additional information. If you do a rating scale and it lines up really well with the hypotheses you generated from your interview, you can have more confidence in that hypothesis. If they don't line up, I wouldn't say it's necessarily your interview was wrong, but you don't have as much confidence, so you proceed with a little more caution. The cons, we've already discussed most of these. They are screening tools. They are not a functional behavior assessment. They get treated that way sometimes, unfortunately. Sometimes well, in many instances, these just give you general information. They don't tell you specific things. So it might say, the function is peer attention. Well, under what conditions? What kind of peer attention? Um, you need more specific information. So, but with an interview can fill in some of the information that isn't included in a rating scale, and the rating scale can give a little more support to an interview. I see them as going together. Some of these have limited reliability and validity information, so some of them do. Actually, the motivation assessment scale, they've done more work with that one than some of the others, but some of them have limited field testing. The reliability and validity of them is not great on any of them. Um, and that has to do with the subjectivity of it. It's simply what you are measuring is the informant's perceptions about these behaviors. And as long as you never lose sight of these, they can be a useful piece of information. People interpret them sometimes as they are providing better information than they're capable of doing. So, indirect methods, they're useful in generating initial hypotheses about a behavior's function. That initial hypothesis, along with good definitions of the behavior, is extremely useful. It can guide you in your next steps. It narrows down what you're having to look at. And I always will start out my data collection process, the direct observation phase. I will start that out by generating questions. What are the questions that are not answered by the interview and rating scales? What am I not so sure about? What do I need to know? And then I look at the kind of data that's going to give me that information. Sometimes it comes down to two hypotheses. Okay, we've got two competing hypotheses for this same response class. Which one is it? Is it both? Sometimes behavior does have two or more functions. Usually one is a primary function, though. In poorly done functional behavior assessment, sometimes I see three functions. That's kind of useless. You're basically saying this behavior serves all purposes under all situations. That's not going to guide you to developing an intervention. So the indirect method can generate initial hypothesis, and you can set the stage for beginning to narrow down things. So as you move into direct observation, you can plan better, you can tailor your data collection to addressing some specific questions. And then if you still need information, then you can think about what are some environmental manipulations that we might be able to do. There are actually some environmental manipulations that are fairly easy to do in school settings. We'll discuss those as we move along in our discussion of functional behavior assessment. But one of them, for example, if you see that there's always a pattern at a certain time of day, and the schedule is such that this particular demand or activity is always happening at that time of day, what is a simple environmental manipulation you could do that's not really putting anyone at risk, yet it's going to answer that question? Is it the time of day, or is it nature of this activity? Well, you simply can move, well, it's not simple. You'd have to actually have the person would have to agree to do it, but um, I've been real successful in getting folks to change schedules on different days so that that activity is offered at a different time of the day. So you may go back and forth a few times. So you got some repeated measures. And if you see that the challenging behavior occurs more within that specific demand, regardless of when it's happening, you're going to know that it's more related to the demands the antecedent instead of just mornings are tough for this kid. Um, you may find that it has nothing to do with that activity. It is just the fact that mornings are tough. That sends you down a different path. So, functional behavior assessment is a process of gathering information that is going to lead you to the information that is going to enable you to develop the most effective intervention.